The vintage clock in the penthouse of the Meridian struck midnight, its deep chimes swallowed by the vast, silent elegance of the living room. Julian sat in the velvet armchair, the city lights of Chicago casting long, cold shadows across the mahogany table. Before him sat a dinner for two that had grown entirely cold, a pair of untouched Wagyu steaks and two crystal glasses. Only one glass held the dark, ruby liquid of a $3,000 Bordeaux. His phone screen illuminated the darkness with a brief, sterile glow. A text from Margot. Merger talks running late. Flight cancelled. I'm so sorry, darling. Happy anniversary. I'll make it up to you tomorrow. Julian didn't reply. He took a slow sip of the wine, letting the bitter tannins coat his tongue. He knew she wasn't in New York. The hidden credit card statement in his desk drawer had already confirmed her reservation at a boutique hotel just 3 miles away, under the name of her supposed rival, Chad Hunter. Margot thought she was playing a clever game of shadows. She didn't realize Julian had already locked the doors from the outside. If stories like this speak to you, where the loudest betrayals are met with the deadliest silence, stay with me. The condensation on the crystal water glass had pooled into a small, perfectly round puddle on the mahogany table. Julian St. James watched it with the detached fascination of a man who had suddenly found the entire world reduced to microscopic details. It was 11:45 p.m. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of their penthouse at the Meridian, the Chicago skyline glittered with an arrogant, icy brilliance. Inside, the silence was absolute. It was their 7th anniversary. On the table sat a culinary masterpiece that would now go straight into the garbage. 2 cuts of Wagyu beef, cold and congealed in their truffle reduction. Asparagus spears that had lost their vibrant green. A bottle of 2009 Chateau Margaux, breathed and ready, its deep ruby contents half gone. Julian had drunk his share. He had not touched Margot's glass. It sat there, an empty monument to an absent wife. His phone vibrated softly against the dark wood. The screen flared, cutting through the dim, amber lighting of the dining room. Margot. Merger talks running late. Flight cancelled due to weather.
I'm so sorry, darling.
Happy anniversary. I'll make it up to you tomorrow, I promise. Love you. Julian didn't blink. He didn't sigh. He merely picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. He could smell the faint scent of her signature perfume, Tom Ford's Black Orchid, lingering on the throw pillow on the sofa where she had sat yesterday, complaining about the stress of her upcoming New York trip. It was a flawless performance. Margot Sinclair was nothing if not a brilliant actress. He swiped away the text and opened a secure, encrypted folder on his phone. There, glowing against the digital darkness, was a PDF scan of a platinum Amex statement. It wasn't the joint account, nor the Sinclair Ventures corporate card. It was an account routed to A.P.O. box in the West Loop. An account Julian had found only because her private assistant had made a singular, fatal error in the mail sorting 3 days ago. The statement read like a diary of betrayal. The charges were frequent and extravagant. Lingerie from agent provocateur. Dinners at obscure, romantic bistros out in the suburbs. And the crown jewel, a recurring massive charge for the penthouse suite at the Archer Hotel, a discreet, hyper-luxury boutique establishment located a mere 3 miles from where Julian currently sat. He looked at the date of the most recent charge. It had been processed yesterday. A 3-night reservation. She wasn't in New York. There was no delayed flight, no weather anomaly, no relentless merger negotiation. She was across town, likely tangled in the high thread count sheets of the Archer with Chad Hunter, the slick, arrogant restructuring consultant she had brought into their firm 6 months ago. A lesser man might have thrown the crystal glass against the window. A weaker man might have driven to the hotel, pounded on the door, and demanded an explanation, letting the rage and humiliation bleed out in a public spectacle. But Julian was a man who built empires by finding structural weaknesses and exploiting them quietly. He was the silent architect behind Sinclair Ventures. He knew the value of leverage. He knew that anger was loud, but true power was completely silent. He typed a reply, his face a mask of smooth, unreadable calm. Don't worry about it, sweetheart. The company comes first. Get some rest. See you tomorrow. Love you too. He hit send. He watched the message deliver. He imagined her phone buzzing on a nightstand in a dark hotel room. Did she smile when she read it? Did she feel a twinge of guilt? Or just the intoxicating thrill of getting away with it? Julian stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt. He picked up his glass of Bordeaux, walking over to the immense window overlooking the city. The reflection staring back at him was not a broken man. It was a man who had just realized he was at war. And in war, the element of surprise was everything. She wanted to play games in the dark. Julian took a slow, deliberate sip of the wine. Fine, he thought, the coldness spreading through his chest, freezing the last remnants of his heart. We will play in the dark. The quiet hum of the private elevator ascending to the penthouse broke the morning silence at precisely 8:15. Julian St. James sat at the marble kitchen island, a cup of black coffee cooling in front of him, the financial section of the newspaper spread out with immaculate precision. The blinding morning light of Chicago washed over the room, erasing the heavy shadows of the previous night. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Margot stepped into the foyer, dragging her leather carry-on with a heavy, theatrical sigh. She was dressed in her charcoal executive suit, the fabric artificially rumpled to simulate a miserable night stranded at LaGuardia. Her blonde hair, usually a perfect cascade, was pinned into a messy twist. God, what a nightmare, she breathed, dropping her designer tote onto the entryway console. Julian slowly folded his newspaper. He commanded his heart rate to remain steady and forced his facial muscles into a mask of warm, husbandly concern. Rough night, sweetheart? She crossed the expansive hardwood floor and wrapped her arms around his neck. Julian's spine rigidified for a microsecond before he commanded his hands to settle naturally on the curve of her waist. As she leaned down to kiss his cheek, the invisible evidence assaulted his senses. There was no scent of recycled jet cabin air, no stale terminal coffee. Instead, his nose caught the faint, unmistakable notes of bergamot and cedar, the signature luxury bath products used exclusively at the Archer Hotel. And lingering beneath that, deeply embedded in the fibers of her silk blouse, was the sharp, spicy undertone of another man's cologne. Chad Hunter's cologne. You have no idea, Margot murmured against his collar, her voice thick with practiced exhaustion. The merger talks dragged in the boardroom until 2 a.m, and then the storm grounded every flight out of New York. I slept on a terrible vinyl lounge chair in the Delta Club. She pulled back, looking down at him. Her hazel eyes were wide, brimming with manufactured guilt. I ruined our 7th anniversary. I am so incredibly sorry, Julian. Julian studied her face with the clinical detachment of a forensic accountant examining a fraudulent ledger. Her skin, despite the carefully applied matte makeup meant to simulate fatigue, possessed a subtle, flushed vitality, a postcoital glow she couldn't entirely erase. She was a magnificent liar, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, Julian almost admired the sheer audacity of her performance. Don't be absurd, Julian said, his voice a perfectly calibrated baritone of reassurance. He reached up, his fingers lightly grazing her jawline to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. He felt the faint pulse in her neck. Steady, unafraid. Sinclair Ventures needed you there. The expansion is critical. We have the rest of our lives to celebrate anniversaries. A soft, genuine sigh of relief escaped her lips. The tension in her shoulders vanished. You are too good to me. Sometimes I think I don't deserve you. You have absolutely no idea how true that is, Julian thought, staring directly into her eyes without blinking. Let me make you something to eat, he offered, turning his back to her to face the polished espresso machine. You must be starving after a flight like that. Or did you manage to grab something decent at the terminal? Margot hesitated. It was only a fraction of a second. A tiny, microscopic glitch in her script, but Julian caught it in the dark, reflective glass of the oven panel. Just terrible airport coffee, she recovered smoothly, pulling out a bar stool. A real breakfast would be absolute heaven. As the espresso machine ground the beans with a harsh, mechanical noise, Julian watched her reflection. She had already pulled out her phone. Her posture shifted instantly from the weary, apologetic wife to the sharp, focused executive. Her thumbs moved rapidly over the screen. A morning greeting to Chad, no doubt. Confirming she had made it home safely, confirming the husband suspected nothing. Julian poured the dark, bitter liquid into a porcelain cup. The cold, calculated satisfaction he had found in the middle of the night solidified into something permanent and unyielding. The board was set. His wife was moving her pieces exactly where he wanted them, completely blind to the trap closing around her. The massive mahogany doors of Julian's corner office at Sinclair Ventures were locked from the inside. It was past midnight on a Tuesday. 50 floors below, the Chicago traffic was reduced to silent, glowing veins of red and white light cutting through the city grid. The only illumination in the room came from the triad of monitors casting an icy blue hue over his sharply tailored silhouette. Margot was asleep in their penthouse, supposedly recovering from the lingering exhaustion of her non-existent New York trip. Julian, however, was wide awake, descending deep into the digital catacombs of their shared empire. The secret platinum Amex statement he had discovered was merely the smoke. Tonight, Julian was hunting for the fire. He knew Margot's financial habits intimately. She was meticulous, proud, and obsessed with maintaining a pristine personal ledger. She would never fund a prolonged, high-end affair out of her own private accounts, where a sudden drain of liquid assets might trigger an alert from their joint wealth manager. She was too smart for that, but she was also undeniably arrogant. His fingers moved across the mechanical keyboard, the quiet, rhythmic clicking echoing like a metronome in the vast space. He bypassed the standard executive dashboards, digging directly into the raw data of the third and fourth quarter departmental ledgers. He cross-referenced the dates of the Amex charges, the lavish dinners, the room service at the Archer Hotel, the exorbitant luxury purchases, with the company's outgoing cash flow. For 3 hours, he found nothing. Her tracks were beautifully swept. But Julian was the man who had rebuilt Sinclair Ventures' internal architecture from the ground up. He knew exactly where the floorboards creaked. He shifted his focus from the marketing budgets to the external vendor accounts, specifically the restructuring initiative led by their newest consultant, Chad Hunter. A subtle pattern emerged from the screen, staring back at him with damning clarity. There it was, an obscure sub-account labeled Strategic Offsite Planning and Vendor Alignment. It was a discretionary fund, cleverly buried beneath layers of corporate jargon, requiring only a single executive signature for approval. Sinclair. Julian pulled up the corresponding invoices. 48 hours before every major charge on the secret Amex, a supplementary invoice from Chad Hunter's consulting firm was submitted and immediately approved by Margot. The amounts were carefully staggered, 8,000 here, 12,000 there, deliberately kept just below the threshold that would automatically trigger a mandatory board review. She wasn't just sleeping with the consultant. She was using Sinclair Ventures as her personal treasury to fund the betrayal. She was making the company, making Julian, pay for her infidelity. A cold, profound stillness settled over him. The initial sting of the affair, the visceral image of another man touching his wife, was suddenly eclipsed by a predatory calm. Margot had crossed a line that separated a failing marriage from corporate malfeasance. She had jeopardized the firm to keep her lover entertained. By mingling company funds with her private sins, she had unwittingly handed Julian the exact weapon he needed. He didn't scream. He didn't clench his fists. Instead, he systematically began to download the ledgers, the invoices, and the approval logs, transferring them to a heavily encrypted external drive. He was no longer merely a husband collecting evidence of a broken vow. He was a fiduciary, silently compiling an airtight dossier of corporate fraud. Julian leaned back in his leather chair, watching the green progress bar on the screen inch toward 100%. The trap was no longer just an abstract concept. It was forged in steel and data. Now, he only needed to wait for her to step fully into the center of it. The Velvet Room was an exercise in curated exclusivity. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and aged bourbon, underscored by the low, pulsing rhythm of a live jazz quartet. Julian St. James stood at the edge of the mahogany bar, a crystal tumbler of Macallan in his hand, his eyes scanning the sea of Chicago's corporate elite. Margot was across the room, radiant in a midnight blue evening gown, effortlessly charming a circle of potential investors. And standing just a few feet away from her, watching her with a proprietary gaze he didn't quite bother to hide, was Chad Hunter. Julian took a slow sip of his scotch. He had studied Chad's dossier extensively over the past 48 hours. 34, a Wharton graduate, a rising star in corporate restructuring known for aggressive tactics and a slick, practiced charm. In person, Chad wore a tailored suit that fit a fraction too tightly, the sartorial choice of a man who needed the room to know exactly how much he spent on himself. As Margot moved toward the terrace with the investors, Chad drifted toward the bar, stepping directly into Julian's orbit. "Julian," Chad said, offering a practiced, blinding smile as he extended a hand. "I don't think we've formally crossed paths since the third quarter review. Incredible event tonight." Julian looked at the extended hand for a microsecond longer than social convention dictated before taking it. Chad's grip was overly firm, a blatant, amateurish display of dominance. Julian's handshake, in contrast, was perfectly calibrated, firm enough to register, loose enough to convey absolute indifference. "Chad," Julian replied, his voice a smooth, resonant baritone. "I appreciate you making the time. I know how heavily you've been investing yourself in Sinclair Ventures lately." Chad chuckled, ordering a martini from the bartender, oblivious to the lethal double meaning. "Margot runs a tight ship, but I like to think my restructuring initiatives are bringing some necessary fresh energy to the firm. We've been putting in a lot of late nights." "So I've been told," Julian said softly. He turned his body slightly, leaning against the polished wood of the bar, assessing the man who was dismantling his marriage. "Margot speaks highly of your stamina, your ability to handle the unexpected hurdles, the delayed flights, the sudden off-site negotiations." A brief flicker of something, perhaps confusion, perhaps a primal instinct recognizing a predator in the room, crossed Chad's face, but his sheer arrogance quickly swallowed it. "It's all about adaptability, Julian. You have to know when to pivot, when to seize an opportunity that presents itself." "Indeed," Julian murmured, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Though I've always found that people who constantly seek new opportunities often fail to secure the foundations of what they already have. They get sloppy. They leave traces." Chad took a sip of his martini, his smile faltering slightly at the edges. The jazz music seemed to fade into the background. The air between them grew suddenly dense, heavy with an unspoken tension that Chad couldn't quite identify, but that Julian was orchestrating flawlessly. "I am a meticulous man, Chad," Julian continued, his gaze drifting lazily to where Margot stood on the terrace, before snapping back to lock onto Chad's eyes with a chilling, dead-eyed intensity. "When I build something, I ensure it is impenetrable. And when I find a structural flaw, I don't just patch it. I tear the entire compromise section down to the bedrock and remove the rot." Chad cleared his throat, suddenly finding his collar a bit too restrictive despite the cool air conditioning of the club. "That sounds like a very thorough approach to business." "It applies to everything," Julian said, offering a thin, razor-sharp smile. He raised his glass in a mock toast, the crystal catching the dim light. "To adaptability, Chad. Enjoy the evening, and enjoy the firm's hospitality while it lasts." Julian walked away, melting into the crowd and leaving Chad standing alone at the bar. The younger man shivered involuntarily under the warm, dim lights of the velvet room, completely unaware that he had just been measured for his own execution. The dining room of the Rosewood Country Club was a sanctuary of hushed voices, heavy drapery, and clinking sterling silver. Julian St. James sat across from Arthur Vance, the oldest founding board member of Sinclair Ventures and a man who had known Margot since she was a child playing in the corporate lobby. Arthur was eating a Waldorf salad with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who held significant equity and demanded absolute stability. Julian did not bring up infidelity. He brought up fiduciary duty. He slid a slim, unmarked leather portfolio across the white linen tablecloth. It did not contain the hotel receipts, the suggestive text transcripts he had managed to clone, or the luxury lingerie purchases. It contained only the aggregated financial data of the Strategic Offsite Planning Fund, scrubbed of its illicit context and presented purely as an unauthorized, alarming bleed of company capital. "I wanted to bring this to you privately, Arthur," Julian said, his voice laced with the heavy, reluctant tone of an executive burdened by a difficult truth. "Before the quarterly review." Arthur wiped his mouth with a napkin and opened the folder, adjusting his reading glasses. The older man's eyes scanned the spreadsheets. Julian sat perfectly still, watching the exact moment the patriarch's mild curiosity morphed into stern, rigid disapproval. "These are substantial discretionary outflows," Arthur murmured, his voice a low rasp. "Authorized solely by Margot. The vendor is Hunter Consulting?" "Yes," Julian replied softly. He took a sip of his sparkling water, his demeanor perfectly composed. "I have no doubt Margot believes these expenditures are justified for the current restructuring phase. She is intensely passionate about the firm's growth. But the lack of oversight, the deliberate bypassing of the standard finance committee approvals, it leaves the company entirely exposed to audit liabilities. As the architect of our current financial compliance, I find it deeply concerning." Julian was playing a masterful, terrifying game of chess. He was using Margot's own aggressive business reputation against her, framing her affair-driven embezzlement as a reckless display of executive hubris. He was not presenting himself as the jealous, broken husband. He was the loyal, pragmatic steward of the Sinclair legacy, stepping in to protect the firm from its own CEO. Arthur closed the folder, resting his wrinkled hands heavily on the leather cover. "Has she discussed these specific, staggered allocations with you?" "She has been incredibly busy, Arthur. The New York merger, the late nights at the office," Julian said, offering a tight, sympathetic smile that flawlessly conveyed a supportive husband covering for an erratic wife. "I haven't wanted to press her while she's under such pressure. But the numbers cannot be ignored. If the SEC or our primary shareholders were to scrutinize this specific vendor relationship without a clear, documented return on investment." He let the sentence hang in the air, a guillotine suspended by a single, fraying thread. Arthur nodded slowly, the trap snapping shut in his mind exactly as Julian had designed. "You are right to bring this to me, Julian. The board cannot turn a blind eye to structural negligence, regardless of the last name on the door. We have a duty to the shareholders. I only want to ensure the firm's stability," Julian said, his tone entirely even, betraying none of the dark triumph blooming in his chest. "I may need your support when the time comes to formally address this in the boardroom. For the good of the company." "You will have it," Arthur promised, his loyalty successfully severed from the Sinclair daughter and anchored securely to the St. James pragmatism. As lunch concluded and they shook hands in the valet line, Julian felt a profound, icy calm wash over him. He had just secured the crucial swing vote. Over the next 48 hours, he would repeat this exact performance with the CFO and the head of the audit committee, tailoring the narrative to their specific corporate anxieties. He was systematically, quietly dismantling the ground beneath Margot's feet, and she was still too busy looking up at the penthouse ceiling with Chad Hunter to realize she was already in freefall. The rain in Chicago had turned into a fine, freezing mist by Thursday afternoon. Julian St. James found Emily Burton sitting alone at a corner table inside Café Lumiere, a delicate porcelain cup of Earl Grey tea resting in front of her. Emily was Margot's oldest friend, the keeper of her secrets, and, Julian suspected, the architect of her carefully constructed alibis. Julian didn't have to orchestrate this meeting. Emily's schedule was as predictable as the tides. He simply walked into the cafe, his tailored cashmere overcoat shedding the damp chill, and slid into the empty velvet chair opposite her. Emily jumped slightly, her manicured fingers rattling her saucer. "Julian," God, you startled me. I didn't know you came to this side of the city. I had a meeting nearby, Julian lied smoothly, signaling the waiter for a black coffee. It's good to see you, Emily. You look tense. Just work? She brushed off, though her eyes darted nervously toward the exit. Public relations is a nightmare this quarter. I can imagine, Julian said, his voice a soothing, deadly calm. Margot has been similarly exhausted. That delayed flight from New York the other night really took it out of her. I don't suppose she called you from the Delta Lounge? She said the reception was terrible. Emily swallowed hard. Julian watched the microscopic movement of her throat. She was deciding which version of the script to read from. Ah yes, she texted me. Poor thing was miserable. Stranded for hours. Julian's coffee arrived. He took a slow, deliberate sip, never breaking eye contact with the woman sitting across from him. It is fascinating, isn't it? He mused softly. The lengths we go to for the people we care about. The stories we tell to protect them. Emily offered a fragile, strained smile. Loyalty is important, Julian. It is, Julian agreed. But loyalty is also an investment. And like any investment, one must constantly assess the risk-to-reward ratio, especially when the principal asset is rapidly depreciating due to hidden liabilities. Emily's smile vanished entirely. The color drained from her perfectly rouged cheeks. She wasn't a corporate shark like Margot, but she wasn't entirely naive either. She recognized the chilling pivot in his tone. I don't know much about finance, Julian, she whispered. It translates perfectly to friendship, Emily. Julian leaned forward slightly, the physical proximity suddenly feeling like a vice grip despite the public setting. If a partner is secretly hemorrhaging funds or, say, spending exorbitant amounts of company time and capital at the Archer Hotel, the auditors eventually find out. The collapse is inevitable. The only question is who gets caught in the blast radius. He let the name of the hotel hang in the air between them like a drawn blade. Emily stopped breathing. Her hands gripped the edge of the marble table, her knuckles turning stark white. Julian saw the exact moment her loyalty to Margot shattered against the bedrock of her own self-preservation. She was terrified. Julian, you don't need to say anything, Julian interrupted, his tone shifting effortlessly back to the warm, supportive husband, making the contrast all the more horrifying to her. I just wanted to check in on you. Margot is lucky to have a friend who is so adaptable. But I would hate to see your own impeccable reputation dragged into a messy, public restructuring of Sinclair Ventures. He stood up, leaving a crisp $100 bill on the table to cover his coffee and her tea. Take care of yourself, Emily. The weather in Chicago is about to get incredibly severe. It would be wise to stay indoors. And keep quiet. He turned and walked out into the mist. Emily remained frozen at the table, her phone sitting untouched inches from her hand. Julian knew she wouldn't call Margot. Fear was a far stronger motivator than friendship, and he had just shown her the monster hiding in the dark. Margot was now completely alone. The walk-in closet of the Meridian penthouse was a sanctuary of custom cedar and soft, recessed lighting. It was Friday evening, and the air hummed with the quiet, domestic intimacy of a husband helping his wife prepare for a journey. Margot stood before the full-length mirror, evaluating a crimson silk dress against her frame, while Julian carefully folded a series of blouses and placed them into her leather carry-on. It's just a weekend strategy retreat, Margot said, her voice carrying a perfectly calibrated note of weary resignation. Chad insists that we need 48 hours of uninterrupted focus to finalize the restructuring proposal before Monday's board meeting. We're taking over a conference room at the Palmer House. Julian smoothed the collar of a white silk blouse, his hands steady and precise. He knew with absolute certainty that there was no conference room booked at the Palmer House. The hidden digital ledger had already updated that morning. A 3-day executive suite reservation at the Archer Hotel, paid for by the obscure vendor account. It makes sense, Julian replied, his tone imbued with nothing but supportive warmth. The restructuring is the most critical phase for Sinclair Ventures right now. You need the isolation to get it right. Distractions will only hurt the firm. He reached for the crimson dress she had just discarded onto the velvet ottoman. As his fingers brushed the delicate fabric, a visceral wave of disgust threatened to rise in his throat. He knew exactly who would be unzipping this dress later tonight. He knew the precise angle of the city view from the suite at the Archer where it would fall to the floor. But Julian was a master of his own physiology. He suppressed the revulsion, folding the silk with the meticulous care of an undertaker preparing a shroud, and tucked it neatly into her suitcase. "You're being incredibly understanding about this, Julian," Margot said, turning to look at him. A fleeting shadow of genuine guilt, or perhaps just the reflex of a very practiced liar, crossed her hazel eyes. "Leaving you alone again so soon after our anniversary feels wrong." "Don't carry that guilt, Margot," Julian said softly. He closed the leather suitcase and pulled the brass zipper taut, the metallic rasp echoing sharply in the quiet closet. "We are partners. Your success is my success. We are building our future." He stood up and closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. Her fingers were warm, her pulse steady. He leaned down and pressed a gentle, lingering kiss to her forehead. It was a kiss executed with flawless, terrifying devotion. "Besides," Julian murmured, stepping back to hand her the handle of the luggage, "I have plenty of work to keep me occupied this weekend. Brian Cooper and I are finalizing some structural paperwork for the firm." Margot smiled, entirely oblivious to the name drop of Chicago's most ruthless corporate litigation attorney. She simply heard the comforting hum of business jargon. "Good. Keep the empire running while I'm gone." "I always do," Julian said. He walked her to the private elevator, watching as the brass doors slid open. Margot blew him a kiss, a picture-perfect portrait of the dedicated executive wife. Julian offered a small, affectionate wave in return. As the doors closed, severing her from his sight, the warmth drained from his face instantly, replaced by a mask of carved ice. The final retreat had begun. She had packed her bags and walked willingly into the abyss. Julian turned back toward the empty penthouse. He finally had the weekend to prepare the boardroom for her execution. Saturday morning broke over Chicago in a wash of slate-gray clouds and relentless, freezing rain. While Margot Sinclair was likely waking up in the tangled, high thread count sheets of the Archer Hotel with Chad Hunter, Julian St. James was sitting in the severe, glass-walled conference room of Sterling and Associates. Across the wide expanse of the polished marble table sat Brian Cooper. Brian was not a family lawyer who dealt in messy emotional disputes. He was a corporate litigator, a man who specialized in the bloodless dismemberment of companies and hostile takeovers. He was exactly the kind of predator Julian needed. Between them sat a black leather binder, 3 inches thick. It was the finalized operational plan for Monday morning. "I have reviewed the ledgers you provided," Brian said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone that betrayed absolutely no moral judgment. He slid a stack of highlighted financial documents across the marble. "The disbursements to Hunter Consulting under the Strategic Offsite Planning Fund are egregious. She authorized them unilaterally, bypassing the Internal Finance Committee. In a vacuum, a defense attorney might argue it was simply aggressive, albeit sloppy, corporate strategy." Julian stared at the documents, his face a mask of carved granite. And combined with the personal context, Brian's thin lips curved into a micro-expression that approximated a smile. Combined with the personal context, the hotel receipts matching the dates of the corporate withdrawals, the geolocation data from the company-issued phone, the undeniable proof of an ongoing affair with the vendor receiving those funds, it is no longer a strategic error. It is embezzlement. It is a blatant breach of fiduciary duty. Julian leaned back in his leather chair, the quiet hum of the building's HVAC system the only sound in the room. He felt no vindication, only the heavy, settling weight of inevitability. "Let us review the prenuptial agreement," Julian commanded softly. Brian opened the back half of the binder, carefully extracting a slightly older, yellow document. It was the contract they had signed 7 years ago, back when Sinclair Ventures was entirely Margot's domain and Julian was just the brilliant outsider architect she had brought in to save it. Section 4, paragraph B. Brian read, tapping a manicured fingernail against the page. The morality clause. It is quite a draconian piece of legal architecture. An immediate forfeiture of executive status, voting rights, and a severe reduction in equity distribution in the event of gross moral turpitude, explicitly including but not limited to documented marital infidelity that jeopardizes the public standing of the firm. Julian remembered the day they signed it. Margot had insisted on that specific clause, terrified that Julian's sudden rise to power and wealth might lead him to embarrass her family's legacy. She had built the very guillotine she was now destined to step into. The board bylaws, Julian murmured, his eyes fixed on the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Do they intersect perfectly? Flawlessly, Brian confirmed, closing the binder with a heavy, satisfying thud. The bylaws stipulate that any executive officer found in violation of their fiduciary duties, specifically involving unauthorized diversion of funds to a romantic partner, is subject to immediate termination by a simple majority vote. You have Arthur Vance? I have Arthur. And I have the CFO, Julian replied, his voice chillingly calm. The trap is set. The moment the emergency board meeting convenes on Monday, her executive powers will be suspended before she even understands what is happening. Brian slid a sleek, silver Mont Blanc fountain pen across the table, along with a single sheet of paper. This is the formal petition to invoke the clause and call the emergency vote. Once you sign this, Julian, there is no unwinding the clock. It goes on the official corporate record. It will be a slaughter. Julian did not hesitate. He picked up the pen. He thought of the cold Wagyu steak on their anniversary. He thought of the scent of Chad's cologne in his foyer. He pressed the nib to the paper, his signature flowing with sharp, decisive strokes. The paperwork was finalized. The storm had gathered its full strength. Now, Julian only had to wait for his wife to come home and step directly into its path. Monday morning arrived in Chicago with a brilliant, deceptive sunlight that offered no actual warmth. Margot Sinclair stepped out of her black town car beneath the towering glass facade of the Sinclair Ventures building. She wore a pristine white designer suit, her posture immaculate. Beneath the tailored fabric, she could still feel the phantom weight of Chad's hands from their weekend at the Archer Hotel. She felt invigorated, powerful, and entirely invincible. The strategy retreat lie had functioned flawlessly. Julian, her steady, predictable husband, suspected absolutely nothing. She took the private elevator to the 50th floor, sipping a macchiato and mentally preparing for the standard weekly executive briefing. But as the chrome doors parted, an unnatural silence greeted her. The executive bullpen, usually buzzing with the frantic energy of junior analysts and ringing phones, was deathly quiet. Her senior assistant, a young woman who usually greeted her with an iPad and a schedule, sat frozen at her desk, her face entirely drained of color. She didn't make eye contact as Margot passed. A faint prickle of unease touched the back of Margot's neck, but she brushed it aside with practiced arrogance. She strode toward the main boardroom, pushing open the heavy, frosted glass doors. She stopped dead. The room was not empty, nor was it occupied by the usual handful of mid-level managers. The entire board of directors was present. Arthur Vance sat rigidly near the center. The chief financial officer was clutching a sleek black binder. And sitting quietly at the far end of the long mahogany table was Brian Cooper, the most ruthless corporate litigator in the Midwest. At the apex of the table, in the high-backed leather chair that belonged exclusively to the CEO, sat Julian. He was not smiling. The warm, supportive husband who had packed her silk dresses just 3 days ago was gone. In his place sat a man carved from glacial ice, his eyes dark, flat, and completely unreadable. Julian, Margot said, her voice faltering for only a fraction of a second before she forced her CEO persona back into place. Arthur? I wasn't aware we had moved the quarterly review up. And why is outside counsel present? She moved toward her usual seat, but Julian raised a single, calm hand. The gesture was slight, but it carried the weight of an iron vault slamming shut. "You will not sit there, Margot," Julian said. His voice was a soft, resonant baritone that carried effortlessly across the cavernous room. It lacked any trace of anger, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. Margot froze, her hand hovering over the back of the leather chair. "Excuse me? Julian, what kind of joke is this? I have a restructuring proposal to present." "There is no proposal," Julian interrupted, his tone perfectly even. He slid a crisp, legally bound document onto the center of the table. "This is a mandatory emergency session of the Board of Directors. You are here because, as of 8:30 this morning, your executive privileges, your voting rights, and your access to the Sinclair Ventures physical and digital infrastructure have been indefinitely suspended." Margot let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. She looked at Arthur Vance, expecting the old family friend to intervene. Arthur simply stared down at his folded hands, refusing to meet her gaze. The panic, sharp and metallic, finally pierced through her arrogance. "On what grounds?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch, the carefully cultivated polish beginning to crack. "I am the CEO. My name is on the building. You cannot simply." "We can and we have," Brian Cooper stated, his gravelly voice cutting through her rising hysteria. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, looking at her with the clinical detachment of a mortician. "Pursuant to the corporate bylaws regarding gross fiduciary negligence, cross-referenced with Section 4, Paragraph B of your formalized prenuptial agreement." The blood drained entirely from Margot's face. The room seemed to tilt violently on its axis. Section 4, Paragraph B. The morality clause. The exact legal framework she had aggressively demanded 7 years ago to protect her family's wealth in case Julian ever humiliated her. She had built the weapon to control him. "Julian," she whispered, her eyes locking onto her husband's face, suddenly realizing she was staring at a stranger. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. He had known. He had known everything, and he had helped her pack her bags. "The board will now review the evidence of your embezzlement. Margot," Julian said coldly, opening the black binder. "Please take a seat. Anywhere else." Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence in the boardroom was already deafening, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic snap of Brian Cooper opening the master dossier. Margot sank into the nearest leather chair at the far end of the mahogany table, her pristine white designer suit suddenly feeling like a straitjacket. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago sun was brilliant, but inside, the temperature had plummeted to absolute zero. "Over the past 6 months," Julian began, his tone as sterile and precise as a surgeon's scalpel, "Sinclair Ventures has experienced a series of unauthorized capital bleeds. These were masked under the guise of restructuring logistics, specifically a sub-account labeled Strategic Offsite Planning." He clicked a small remote. The massive screen at the end of the room hummed to life, projecting a glaring white spreadsheet that illuminated the grim faces of the board members. It was a side-by-side comparison. On the left, the corporate ledger showing staggered withdrawals of $8, $12, and $15,000. On the right, the detailed Platinum Amex statement routed to the West Loop P.O. box. Margot's breath hitched violently. Her eyes widened, tracking the dates. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably against the polished wood of the table. "As you can see," Julian continued smoothly, pacing slowly behind the high-backed CEO chair he had rightfully claimed, "every corporate withdrawal corresponds perfectly, within a 48-hour window, to exorbitant personal expenses. Luxury dining, high-end retail." He paused, letting his dark, flat gaze drift to his wife. "And extensive, recurring reservations for the penthouse suite at the Archer Hotel." A collective heavy breath escaped the board members. Arthur Vance removed his wire-rimmed glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose in profound disappointment. The chief financial officer stared at the screen, visibly appalled. "Julian, you can't." Margot whispered, her voice trembling. The meticulously built fortress of her arrogance was crumbling to dust in front of her eyes. She looked at him, desperately searching for the man who had kissed her forehead on Friday night, the man who had carefully folded her crimson silk dress into her luggage. He wasn't there. He had never been there. The psychological horror of the realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He packed my bags. He smiled at me. He knew everything, and he helped me walk out the door. "I assure you, Margot, I can," Julian replied softly. He wasn't looking at her with the heartbreak of a betrayed husband. He was looking at her like a toxic asset he was finally writing off. The vendor receiving the corporate funds is Hunter Consulting, specifically Chad Hunter, the exact same man who, according to the geolocation data of your company phone and the private investigator's photographs from this past weekend, you spent the last 48 hours with while supposedly conducting a strategy retreat at the Palmer House. Another click of the remote. The screen shifted from spreadsheets to a crisp, high-resolution photograph of Margot and Chad kissing in the valet line of the Archer. "It was a mistake," Margot blurted out, the panic finally breaking entirely through her polish. She turned to Arthur, her voice shrill, pleading. "Arthur, please. It was a lapse in personal judgment. I can repay the discretionary funds by tomorrow morning. I can fix this. You've known me my entire life." Arthur didn't look up from his folded hands. "You stole from the firm to fund an affair with a vendor, Margot. You exposed us to catastrophic audit liabilities and potential blackmail. Your father would be utterly ashamed. The violation of the morality clause in the prenuptial agreement is irrefutable." Brian Cooper interjected, his voice gravelly and definitive, cutting off Margot's next sob. "Coupled with the blatant fiduciary breach, the board has already drafted the termination of your executive contract. Your shares will be frozen immediately and placed in a blind trust to offset the embezzled capital and any potential public relations damages." Margot sat paralyzed. The room spun violently. She had walked into this building as a queen, the undisputed heir to a financial dynasty. In less than 10 minutes, Julian had reduced her to a destitute liability. He hadn't just divorced her. He had surgically excised her from her own legacy, leaving her with absolutely nothing. The elevator ride down from the 50th floor took exactly 42 seconds, but to Margot Sinclair, it felt like a descent into the center of the earth. When the chrome doors parted at the lobby level, the security guards, men who had greeted her warmly by name for the past 7 years, did not make eye contact. Her keycard had already been deactivated by the system. She was escorted to the revolving glass doors not as a reigning CEO, but as a corporate trespasser. The midday Chicago sun struck her face, blinding and indifferent. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely unlock her phone to request a rideshare. Her corporate town car and driver had, of course, been immediately revoked. She needed Chad. She needed the man who, just 48 hours ago in the penthouse of the Archer Hotel, had whispered that she was the most powerful, intoxicating woman he had ever known. She directed the driver to his luxury condo in the Gold Coast, her mind racing frantically to construct a new narrative. They could start their own boutique consulting firm. She still had her pedigree, her industry contacts. They would rebuild together. Julian had won the boardroom ambush, but not the war. When Chad opened the heavy oak door of his apartment, he was already dressed in a sharp charcoal travel suit, a Bluetooth earpiece blinking discreetly. He didn't pull her into a desperate embrace. He didn't even step aside to let her fully into the foyer. "I heard," Chad said, his voice dropping into a low, cautious register. He looked up and down the hallway before pulling her inside and firmly shutting the door. "My firm received a formal notice from Brian Cooper's office 20 minutes ago. The strategic off-site planning contract has been terminated with extreme prejudice. They are threatening litigation to recover the disbursed funds." Margot reached for his arm, her manicured fingers digging into the expensive wool of his sleeve. "Chad, listen to me. Julian blindsided me. He invoked a dormant trap in my prenup. It's a temporary setback. I just need your legal team to help me file an injunction. We can fight this together." Chad stepped back, gently but decisively disengaging her grip. The proprietary, hungry gaze he had leveled at her in the velvet room was entirely gone. In its place was the cold, calculating stare of a man assessing a toxic liability. "Fight this," Chad echoed, a harsh, humorless laugh escaping his chest. "Margot, there is no fighting this. Your husband didn't just fire you. He handed my partners a documented paper trail of corporate embezzlement. Do you have any idea what kind of SEC audit nightmare you've just dragged me into?" "I did that for us." Margot's voice cracked, the raw desperation finally bleeding through her shattered polish. "I authorized those payments so we could have time together, so I could compensate you while we planned our exit strategy." "You compensated me with stolen corporate capital," Chad corrected sharply, his tone devoid of any lingering warmth. "You assured me the discretionary fund was entirely within your unilateral purview. You lied. You got sloppy, Margot. And in my line of work, sloppy is a fatal contagion." He walked over to his sleek glass desk, picking up a leather overnight briefcase. The realization hit Margot with the physical force of a localized earthquake. The passion, the late-night confessions, the supposed deep emotional connection. It had all been a brilliant, calculated transaction. He had loved the CEO of Sinclair Ventures. He had absolutely no use for the disgraced, penniless woman standing weeping in his foyer. "Where are you going?" she whispered, the room spinning violently around her. "I have a flight to Dallas. I need to get ahead of this fallout before my own board votes me out for gross negligence," Chad said, refusing to look at her. He paused at the door, offering a final, pitying glance that cut deeper than any insult.
I'm sorry, Margot.
"But you are completely radioactive right now. Do not call my private number again. My attorneys will handle all further communication." The door clicked shut, the metallic sound echoing in the cavernous, quiet apartment. Margot stood alone in the center of the pristine room. She had sacrificed her marriage, her reputation, and her family's entire legacy for a man who had just discarded her faster than a depreciating stock. The fall was complete, and she had finally hit the concrete at the bottom. 3 months later, the Chicago autumn had stripped the trees bare, the gray sky over Lake Michigan perfectly matching the stark, echoing emptiness of the Meridian penthouse. The long mahogany dining table, the very same surface that had hosted their cold, untouched anniversary dinner, now held only a neat stack of heavily watermarked legal documents. The divorce decree, the final severance of Margot Sinclair from her own family's legacy. Julian St. James stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a crystal glass of bourbon in his hand, watching the city lights begin to flicker against the gathering dusk. He heard the private elevator chime, followed by the soft, hesitant click of low heels on the hardwood floor. Margot entered the room. The transformation was jarring. The radiant, arrogant CEO who used to command boardrooms in pristine white designer suits was completely gone. She wore a simple camel trench coat, her face pale, her eyes hollowed out by months of relentless legal battles, public humiliation, and financial ruin. She had fought tooth and nail, but Brian Cooper had built an impenetrable fortress around Julian. The morality clause had held. The board had remained loyal to the man who secured their wealth, leaving the disgraced heiress to quietly suffocate. She stopped at the edge of the table, looking down at the papers. A heavy silver pen rested beside the final signature line. "Brian's office sent the courier over an hour ago." Margot's voice was a frail whisper, entirely devoid of its former authority. "This is the transfer of the penthouse deed, the final dissolution of the blind trust." "It is," Julian replied, his back still turned to her. He did not feel the triumphant rush of a conqueror. He felt only a vast, freezing void settling deep within his ribs. He had executed the perfect corporate slaughter, but the battlefield was his own home. Margot picked up the pen. Her hand trembled violently as she signed her name for the final time, relinquishing the very last piece of the Sinclair dynasty to the man she had betrayed. The sharp scratching of the nib against the thick paper sounded deafening in the quiet room. When she finished, she dropped the pen, clattered against the wood. She looked at Julian's broad, unmoving shoulders, a sudden, desperate bitterness flaring in her exhausted eyes. "You planned it flawlessly," she said, her voice trembling with a toxic mixture of hatred and profound, agonizing regret. You didn't just divorce me, Julian. You erased me. You took my family's name, my life's work, my reputation. You left me with absolutely nothing. Tell me the truth just once. Was the Empire really worth destroying us? Was this your endgame all along? Julian finally turned away from the window. He looked at the woman he had once loved with a quiet, terrifying devotion. He saw the wreckage of her pride, the ghost of the empire they had built together, and the chilling reality that he felt absolutely no pity for her. I built this foundation to last, Margot, Julian said, his baritone voice smooth and mercilessly calm. You were the one who brought a match into the house. I simply locked the doors before you could burn me with it. Margot stared at him, tears finally spilling over her lashes, realizing the absolute, crushing finality of her own destruction. Chad had abandoned her. Her friends had vanished. And the husband she thought she could outsmart was standing over the ashes of her life, completely untouched. You are a monster, she whispered. No, Julian corrected softly, his dark gaze dropping to the signed divorce papers on the table. You kept the lies, Margot. I'll just keep the empire. A suffocating silence descended upon the penthouse. Margot had no weapons left, no words to change the narrative. She turned, her shoulders slumped beneath the heavy coat, and walked slowly back to the elevator. The brass doors closed, sealing her out of his world forever. Julian stood alone in the vast, immaculate living room. The silence he had weaponized was now his only companion. He looked down at his left hand. The platinum band still rested on his ring finger, a heavy, meaningless shackle tied to a ghost. With deliberate, unhurried movements, Julian slid the cold metal over his knuckle. He placed the wedding ring onto the polished surface of the mahogany table, right beside the signed divorce decree. Without looking back, he turned and walked away into the deepening shadows of the empty penthouse.